Topic 4.2: The Rise of Political Parties in the Era of Jefferson. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. Thomas Jefferson, First Inaugural Address, 1801. Learning objective: explain the causes and effects of policy debates in the early republic. Despite President Washington's warning against forming political parties, two groups quickly emerged in the new republic: the Federalists, following visions of Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, espousing Thomas Jefferson's views, competed for public approval and control of the government. The election of 1800. During Adams's presidency, the Federalists rapidly lost popularity. People disliked the Alien and Sedition Acts. Further, they complained about the new taxes imposed to pay for a possible war against France. Though Adams avoided war, he had persuaded Congress that building up the U.S. Navy was necessary for the nation's defense. Establishment of political parties. The presidential election of 1800 provided the first election with a clear choice between political parties. The Federalist Party stood for a stronger national government and leaned toward Great Britain in European affairs. The Democratic Republican Party emphasized the powers reserved to states and leaned toward the French. Both parties supported tariffs on imports as a way to raise revenue. Throughout the 19th century, tariffs would be the largest single source of revenue for the federal government. The debate on tariffs broke down on regional lines. Northern industrialists wanted higher tariffs to protect their companies from foreign competition. Southerners relied on export of cotton and other crops. They pushed for lower tariffs in order to encourage trade. Election results. Determining the winner of the 1800 presidential election was complicated. According to the original Constitution, each member of the Electoral College cast 2 votes for president. The winner became president, and the second-place finisher became vice president. In 1800, a majority of presidential electors cast their ballots for 2 Democratic Republicans, one for Thomas Jefferson and one for Aaron Burr. The two tied for the presidency. As the Constitution required, the House of Representatives voted to choose the winner, with each state allowed 1 vote. They debated and voted for days before they finally gave a majority to Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton had urged his followers to support Jefferson, whom he considered less dangerous and of higher character than Burr. Democratic Republican lawmakers elected in 1800 also took control of both the House and the Senate in the elections, so the Federalists had been swept from power in both the executive and legislative branches of the U.S. government. A peaceful revolution. The passing of power in 1801 from one political party to another was accomplished without violence. This was a rare event for the times and a major indication that the U.S. constitutional system would endure the various strains that were placed upon it. The Federalists quietly accepted their defeat in the election of 1800 and peacefully relinquished control of the federal government to Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans. The change from Federalist to Democratic Republican control is known as the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson's presidency. During his first term, Jefferson attempted to win the allegiance and trust of Federalist opponents by maintaining the national bank and debt repayment plan of Hamilton. In foreign policy, he carried on the neutrality policies of Washington and Adams. At the same time, Jefferson retained the loyalty of Democratic Republican supporters by adhering to his party's guiding principle of limited central government. He reduced the size of military, eliminated a number of federal jobs, repealed the excise taxes, including those on whiskey, and lowered the national debt. However, hoping to avoid internal divisions that distracted Washington, he appointed only Democratic Republicans to his cabinet. Compared to Adams's troubled administration, Jefferson's first 4 years in office were relatively free of discord. The Louisiana Purchase. The single most important achievement of Jefferson's first administration was the acquisition by purchase of vast western lands known as the Louisiana Territory. This region encompassed a large tract of western land through which the Mississippi and Missouri rivers flowed, land little explored by the Europeans. At the mouth of the Mississippi lay the territory's most valuable property in the terms of commerce, the port of New Orleans. The Louisiana Territory had once been claimed by France, which then lost its claim to Spain. But in 1800, the French military and political leader Napoleon Bonaparte secretly forced Spain to give the Louisiana Territory back to France. Napoleon hoped to restore the French Empire in the Americas. By 1803, however, Napoleon had lost interest in this plan for 2 reasons. He wanted to concentrate French resources on fighting Great Britain. A rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture against French rule on the island of Santo Domingo had resulted in heavy French losses. U.S. interest in the Mississippi River. During Jefferson's presidency, the western frontier extended beyond Ohio and Kentucky into the Indiana Territory. Settlers in this region depended for their economic existence on transporting goods on rivers that flowed westward into the Mississippi and southward as far as New Orleans. They were greatly alarmed, therefore, when in 1802 Spanish officials, who were still in charge of New Orleans, closed the port to Americans. They revoked the right of deposit granted in the Pinckney Treaty of 1795, which had allowed American farmers tax-free use of the port. People on the frontier clamored for government action. In addition to being concerned about the economic impact of the closing of New Orleans, President Jefferson was troubled by its consequences on foreign policy. He feared that so long as a foreign power controlled the river at New Orleans, the United States risked entanglement in European affairs. Negotiations. Jefferson sent ministers to France with instructions to offer up to $10 million for both New Orleans and a strip of land extending from that port eastward to Florida. If the American ministers failed in their negotiations with the French, they were instructed to begin discussions with Britain for a U.S.-Britain alliance. Napoleon's ministers, seeking funds for a war against Britain, offered to sell not only New Orleans but also the entire Louisiana Territory for $50 million. The opportunity to purchase so much land surprised the American ministers. They quickly went beyond their instructions and accepted the French offer. Constitutional predicament. Jefferson and most Americans strongly approved of the Louisiana Purchase. Nevertheless, a constitutional problem troubled the president. Jefferson was committed to a strict interpretation of the Constitution and rejected Hamilton's argument that certain powers were implied. No clause in the Constitution explicitly stated that a president could purchase foreign land. In this case, Jefferson determined to set aside his idealism for the country's good. He submitted the purchase agreement to the Senate, arguing that lands could be added to the United States as an application of the president's power to make treaties. Federalist senators criticized the treaty. However, casting aside the Federalist attacks, the Democratic-Republican majority in the Senate quickly ratified the purchase. Consequences. The Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States, removed a European presence from the nation's borders, and extended the western frontier to lands beyond the Mississippi. Furthermore, the acquisition of millions of acres of land strengthened Jefferson's hopes that his country's future will be based on an agrarian society of independent farmers rather than Hamilton's vision of an urban and industrial society. In political terms, the Louisiana Purchase increased Jefferson's popularity and showed that Federalists, to be a weak, sectionalist, New England-based party, could do little more than complain about Democratic Republican policies. Lewis and Clark Expedition. Even before Louisiana was purchased, Jefferson had persuaded Congress to fund a scientific exploration of the Trans-Mississippi West to be led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark. The Louisiana Purchase greatly increased the importance of the expedition. Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis in 1804, crossed the Rockies, reached the Oregon coast on the Pacific Ocean, and then turned back and completed the return journey in 1806. The benefits of the expedition were many: greater geographic and scientific knowledge of the region, stronger U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory, better relations with American Indians, and more accurate maps and land routes for fur trappers and future settlers. Judicial impeachments. Jefferson tried various methods for overturning past Federalist measures and appointments. Soon after entering office, he suspended the Alien and Sedition Acts and released those jailed under them. The Federalist appointments to the courts previously made by Washington and Adams were not subject to recall or removal except by impeachment. Federalist judges therefore continued in office, much to the annoyance of the Democratic Republican President Jefferson. Hoping to remove partisan Federalist judges, Jefferson supported a campaign of impeachment. The judge of one federal district was found to be mentally imbalanced. The House voted for his impeachment, and the Senate then voted to remove him. The House also impeached a Supreme Court Justice, Samuel Chase, but the Senate acquitted him after finding no evidence of high crimes. Except for these two cases, the impeachment campaign was largely a failure, as almost all Federalist judges remained in office. Even so, the threat of impeachment caused the judges to be more cautious and less partisan in their decisions. Jefferson's re-election. In 1804, Jefferson won re-election by an overwhelming margin, receiving all but 14 of the 176 electoral votes. His second term was marked by growing difficulties. He faced a plot by his former vice president, Aaron Burr. The Democratic-Republican Party split, with a faction, the Quids, accusing him of abandoning the party's principles. Foreign troubles came from the Napoleonic War in Europe. Aaron Burr. A Democratic-Republican caucus, a closed meeting in 1804, decided not to nominate Aaron Burr for a second term as vice president. Burr then embarked on a series of ventures, one of which threatened to break up the Union, and another which resulted in the death of Alexander Hamilton. Federalist conspiracy. Secretly forming a political pact with some radical New England Federalists, Burr planned to win the governorship of New York in 1804, unite that state with the New England states, and then lead this group of states to secede from the nation. Most Federalists followed Alexander Hamilton in opposing Burr, who was defeated in the New York election. The conspiracy then disintegrated. Duel with Hamilton. Angered by an insulting remark attributed to Hamilton, Burr challenged a Federalist leader to a duel and fatally shot him. Hamilton's death in 1804 deprived the Federalists of their last great leader and earned Burr the enmity of many. Trial for treason. By 1806, Burr's intrigues had turned westward with a plan to take Mexico from Spain and possibly unite it with Louisiana under his rule. Learning of the conspiracy, Jefferson ordered Burr's arrest and trial for treason. Presiding at the trial was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall, a longtime adversary of Jefferson. A jury acquitted Burr, basing its decision on Marshall's narrow definition of treason and the lack of witnesses to any overt act by Burr. John Marshall's Supreme Court and federal power. One Federalist official continued to have major influence throughout the years of Democratic-Republican ascendancy, John Marshall. His decisions consistently favored the central government and the rights of property against the advocates of states' rights. John Marshall. Ironically, the Federalist judge who caused Jefferson the most grief was one of his own cousins from Virginia, John Marshall. Marshall had been appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the final month of the presidency of John Adams. He held his post for 34 years, during which time he exerted as strong an influence on the Supreme Court as Washington had exerted on the presidency. Even when justices appointed by Democratic Republican presidents formed a majority on the court, they often sided with Marshall because they were persuaded that the U.S. Constitution had created a federal government with strong and flexible powers. Influential cases. Several of Marshall's decisions became landmarks that defined the relationship between the central government and the states. First and foremost of these was Marbury v. Madison, 1803, which established the principle of judicial review. Marbury v. Madison, 1803. The first major case decided by Marshall put him in direct conflict with President Jefferson. Just before leaving office, President John Adams made several midnight appointments of Federalists as judges. However, their commissions were not formally delivered before Jefferson took office. Jefferson wanted to block these appointments, so he ordered the new Secretary of the State, James Madison, not to deliver the commissions. One of Adams' appointees, William Marbury, sued for his commission. The case of Marbury v. Madison went to the Supreme Court in 1803. Marshall ruled that Marbury had a right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act passed by Congress in 1789. However, Marshall said the Judiciary Act of 1789 had given to the court greater power than the Constitution allowed. Therefore, the law was unconstitutional and Marbury would not receive his commission. In effect, Marshall sacrificed what would have been a small Federalist gain, the appointment of Marbury, for a much larger long-term judicial victory. By ruling a law of Congress to be unconstitutional, Marshall established the doctrine of judicial review. From this point on, the Supreme Court would exercise the power to decide whether an act of Congress or of the President was allowed by the Constitution. The Supreme Court could now overrule actions of the other two branches of the federal government. Fletcher v. Peck, 1810. In a case involving land fraud in Georgia, Marshall concluded that a state could not pass legislation invalidating a contract. This was the first time that the Supreme Court declared a state law to be unconstitutional and invalid. In Marbury v. Madison, the court ruled a federal law unconstitutional. Martin v. Hunter's lease, 1816. The Supreme Court established that it had jurisdiction over state courts in cases involving constitutional rights. Dartmouth College v. Woodward, 1819. This case involved a law of New Hampshire that changed Dartmouth College from a privately chartered college into a public institution. The Marshall Court struck down the state law as unconstitutional, arguing that a contract for a private corporation could not be altered by the state. McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819. Maryland attempted to tax the second bank of the United States, which was located in Maryland. Marshall ruled that a state could not tax a federal institution because the power to tax is the power to destroy, and federal laws are supreme over state laws. In addition, Marshall settled the long-running debate over constitutionality of the National Bank. Using a loose interpretation of the Constitution, Marshall ruled that even though no clause in the Constitution specifically mentions a national bank, the Constitution gave the federal government the implied power to create one. Cohens v. Virginia, 1821. A pair of brothers named Cohen were convicted in Virginia of illegally selling tickets for a lottery authorized by Congress for Washington, D.C. While Marshall and the court upheld the conviction, they established the principle that the Supreme Court could review a state court's decision involving any of the powers of the federal government. Gibbons versus Ogden, 1821. Could the state of New York grant a monopoly to a steamboat company if that action conflicted with a charter authorized by Congress? In ruling that the New York monopoly was unconstitutional, Marshall established the federal government's broad control of interstate commerce. Madison's presidency. Jefferson believed strongly in the precedent set by Washington of voluntarily retiring from the presidency after a second term. For his party's nomination for president, he supported his close friend, Secretary of the State James Madison. The election of 1808. Ever since leading the effort to write and ratify the Constitution, Madison was widely viewed as a brilliant thinker. He had worked tirelessly with Jefferson in developing the Democratic-Republican Party. On the other hand, he was a weak public speaker, possessed a stubborn temperament, and lacked Jefferson's political skills. With Jefferson's backing, Madison was nominated for president by a caucus of congressional Democratic Republicans. Other factions of the Democratic-Republican Party nominated 2 other candidates. Even so, Madison was able to win a majority of electoral votes and to defeat both his Democratic-Republican opponents and the Federalist candidate, Charles Pinckney. Key terms by theme. Decisions. Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase, Aaron Burr, Exploration, Lewis and Clark, Supreme Court, Strict Interpretation, John Marshall, Judicial Review, Marbury versus Madison, Fletcher versus Peck, McCulloch versus Maryland, Dartmouth College versus Woodward, Gibbons versus Ogden, Implied Powers.